Hello. Part 2 of our unit is on cell respiration. This is the process of breaking down glucose so that cells can use it. So this happens in both autotrophs and heterotrophs. Our energy cycle on Earth kind of starts with the sun. The sun's energy is taken in by certain autotrophs, and then they make it into glucose, seen in our photosynthesis video. So then the autotrophs themselves, so plants, as well as any organisms that eat plants, will take the glucose and they'll break it down and get the energy out of it. So the first step in releasing that energy from the glucose is called glycolysis. So if you remember, lysis means to break, right? We had the lytic cycle for viruses. So glycolysis is to break glucose. So glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm of our cells. So it's just outside in that jelly-like substance that our cells are made of. The second step depends on whether there is oxygen present or not. So if it is anaerobic, this is the form of cell respiration that takes place in the absence of oxygen. If it's aerobic, the form of cell respiration occurs with oxygen. So if you've ever heard of aerobics as an exercise, that you use a lot of oxygen. So this is Richard Simmons. He was one of the first aerobic instructors that hit the TVs in like the 80s. So aerobics is with oxygen, anaerobic, there's no oxygen. Here's a picture. You can see glucose. It has 6 carbons. That's how they are showing it. It goes through glycolysis, and we get an ATP out of it. Remember, this is what your cells will use as energy. So the sun's energy is taken in by plants. Plants make it into glucose. We break it down and make it into ATP. So after it goes through glycolysis, it has the option, depending on the organism, of going into what's called fermentation if you don't have oxygen or you're anaerobic. Or if you have oxygen, it goes into something called the Krebs cycle and then the electron transport chain. We're going to quickly go through these. So when we have oxygen, it is aerobic. Cell respiration is the process that releases energy by breaking down glucose and other molecules in the presence of oxygen. If you remember, respiration, normally we think of as breathing. And because we breathe in oxygen, a lot of people think that's where it ends. The reason we need to breathe oxygen in is to get it to our cells, where our cells will actually use oxygen in this process. So the chemical equation is the glucose, which is that C6H12O6, and then the oxygen that we breathe in, and we breathe out carbon dioxide and water. Our cells keep the energy stored as ATP. This is the exact opposite of photosynthesis, making a cycle, which we see a lot of cycles in biology. So here's the word equation. Glucose plus oxygen gives you water, carbon dioxide, and energy in the form of ATP. So cell respiration with oxygen has 3 steps: glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. So if you remember, the glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm. They also call it cytosol. Then the products will go into our mitochondrion, or mitochondria if it's plural, and it will go through these other cycles if you have oxygen. So you'll get a lot of ATP if you have oxygen. It's a big difference. So during the Krebs cycle, the pyruvic acid, so what you break glucose down into, is used to make carbon dioxide and then carry all of those electrons and make ATP. The electron transport chain uses high energy electrons to convert the ADP to ATP. So that's, remember, this is the main thing. We're trying to take our energy and make ATP. If you don't have oxygen, this is called anaerobic or fermentation. Fermentation is a process that releases energy from food without using oxygen, known as anaerobic respiration, which translates into not in air. So fermentation starts with glycolysis, and then it makes ATP on its own. There are two main types of fermentation you've probably heard before. Alcoholic fermentation. This produces ethyl alcohol, carbon dioxide, and the byproduct NAD+. This is carried out by yeast and other microscopic organisms. We use it to make bread. We put yeast into a dough, give them a little sugar, and they eat it, and they produce carbon dioxide, which bubbles up our bread. That is why our bread is nice and fluffy. If you push bread down when you're making the dough and push all of that carbon dioxide out, you end up with a very flat bread. The other type of fermentation is called lactic acid fermentation. It produces lactic acid and that NAD+. This occurs in your muscles when there is not enough oxygen, as well as in unicellular organisms, because they sometimes don't live in the presence of oxygen. So in us, in our muscles, it results in cramps because the lactic acid will build up. So this is why when you finish a run, you're not supposed to just stop. You're supposed to continue walking around and try to breathe deeply to get oxygen into your body. You don't want your body to have a lack of oxygen and then start this lactic acid fermentation, which will result in cramps. It's also used in the product of making cheese, yogurt, buttermilk, and sour cream. So we mentioned that our yogurts and these products have our bacteria in them. Another side effect is that they make lactic acid, and it's part of the taste of these products. So speaking of your muscles and energy and exercise, a runner has enough stored ATP for 50 meters. So think about ATP as your basic form of energy. So you can do a sprint. Then the muscles need to use lactic acid fermentation to produce ATP in addition to trying to go through cellular respiration. Your body then stores long-term energy in the form of the carbohydrate called glycogen, and then as fats. So the more someone runs as a habit, the better their body is at going through these processes without the side issues of cramps and not feeling good, because your body gets used to being able to switch. If you have an excess storage of fat, what this means is you have to go through all of the ATP store, and then you have to go through all of your store of glycogen before you can start breaking down the fats. So most health doctors talk about exercise needing to be longer than a half hour to try to break down into that fat store. So here is just a chart comparing our two processes. So we have photosynthesis. Its job or function is to capture energy. It happens in the chloroplast. The reactants, or what goes into the reaction, is carbon dioxide and water. What comes out, or the products, are glucose and oxygen. And then you have the equation at the bottom. Cellular respiration, therefore, is energy release. This happens in the mitochondria, and the reactants and products you can see are opposite that of photosynthesis. And that is it for our video.